Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be a wonderful and informative discussion between two very learned, personable, and wonderful Kenyon alums. My name is Ted Mason. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a professor of English here. I'm also the Associate Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Senior Advisor to President Kornfeld for matters of DEI and belonging. I've been at Kenyon since 1989. I'm also a parent of a Kenyon graduate in the class of 2010. I'm going to do a brief introduction of our two participants this evening and give you a very, very brief description of one part of the professional development activities here at Kenyon that connects with our subject tonight. And then I will turn it over to Ted and Mel, who will give us a wonderful conversation for the balance of the hour. We're joined by Melzetta Moody and Ted Samuel. Mel is currently head of people and culture for the Article Group in the Bay Area, and Mel is designing and building a world-class employee experience for all AG and AGO employees. She is responsible for building the internal infrastructure to support organizational development and strategic growth. And prior to her current role at the Article Group, Melzetta has held leadership positions in financial services, fintech, telecommunications, technology, and pharmaceutical industries. And she graduated from Kenyon with a degree in international studies and Spanish and holds an MBA from the University of Rochester Simon School of Business. I know Mel not only from her time here, but also her time on the Board of Trustees. She is an important member of the board's Inclusion and Equity Committee. You should know, by the way, that among small liberal arts colleges, Kenyon is among the first to have an Inclusion and Equity Committee on the board. It began as a diversity committee and then morphed into the Inclusion and Equity Committee. We are grateful for Mel's expertise and contributions to the work that committee does. Ted Samuel is an anthropologist and nonprofit leader with extensive experience in designing and directing global education, leadership development, and exchange programs. His career has spanned 3 continents, where he has worked directly with journalists, artists, educators, and grassroots activists to develop initiatives that foster intercultural learning while amplifying the voices and stories of historically oppressed people. Currently, Ted serves as Senior Director of Oberlin Chauncey, a nonprofit organization that seeks to deepen mutual respect and understanding between the United States and Asia. Since 2018, he has worked to democratize Chauncey's grant and fellowship opportunities. He developed training sessions and mentorship opportunities for LGBTQ+ and BIPOC fellows and secured support funds to provide a safety net for low-income programs and participants. I would also say that among his many other activities, Ted was a significant contributor to an ODEI, a Kenyon ODEI-sponsored initiative, a retreat for leadership, leadership of Kenyon's affinity groups. And the goal of that program was to find ways of helping presidents, vice presidents, treasurers, et cetera, officers of affinity groups develop their leadership skills and learn things such as conflict resolution, organization, planning, et cetera. One of the things you should know that this is a very fortuitous topic this evening, because you likely do not know, but Kenyon has joined the College of Independent Counsel's Belong Network, and the Belong Network provides professional development opportunities for staff and faculty relative to diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and anti-racism. Among the resources from the Belong Network are four annual webinars. One of those webinars this year, earlier this fall, focused on imposter syndrome and stereotype threat. You should know that among the many members of the CIC Belong Network, Kenyon had the most participants in these webinars, and that is a good sign. So I will turn it over to Ted and Mel, who will have a wonderful conversation, I'm sure informing all of us about imposter phenomenon and stereotype. Brett, Ted, Mel, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who has joined us this evening.
Thank you so much, Ted. And I caution myself saying Ted because I am not old enough to call you Ted yet, Professor Mason. And I don't think I ever will be. Anyway, thank you so much for such a gracious introduction. Hi, everybody. There's so many people here from like different walks of life. It's really good to see you all, and hopefully you'll enjoy the conversation we have in store for you. I'm going to kick us off. First of all, thank you for joining us. Just a little background about Ted and I that Professor Mason didn't cover is that Ted and I are affectionately known as Melted. So please feel free to refer to the duo as such. We met the summer before freshman year in 2001. Old. We're very, very old, Ted, at this point. That was over 20 years ago as HHMI scholars. And we have been inseparable ever since. And so today I want to take the time to orient us and align us on what we will be accomplishing or talking about today. So first, we'll discuss why we're here. Like, why even are we here right now? Second, we'll define some key terms just so we're all aligned and we're all grounded in the same definitions of some key information. Ted and I will go through and share some personal stories, and then we'll leave you with some takeaways. Pretty simple. We only have 50 minutes left, so we'll try to get through this as efficiently as possible. We'll try to save time for Q&A at the end, but just understand that if we don't, it's nothing personal. We just like to talk. So as you listen to our stories, I invite you to reflect on your own experiences, but I do want to offer a few disclaimers. One, our words are our own. So if we say something that pisses you off, talk to us, not our jobs, not our people, our family. Our words are our own, right? And so what we say, we're representing from our own experiences. Two, if you feel offense or take offense to anything that is said today, please understand that is not our intent. Also, and lastly, we know that some of you know a lot of this stuff already, but for the purpose of catering to a larger and wider audience, we're intentionally speaking about imposter syndrome in this specific way to be able to meet everybody where they are. Okay. All right. Perfect. So why this topic? Let's see. So to be honest, over the last few years, Ted and I have talked about imposterism in our own personal and professional experiences, especially early in our careers. And not just from an academic theoretical perspective, it's more of like how we've experienced it in our own ways at Kenyon and even after Kenyon. So we are very lucky to have one another. We have each other as coaches and sometimes hype people, right? We need to remind each other of how awesome we are and to coach one another out of those sort of stints that you get into when you're experiencing imposterism. It feels like only recently, the popularity of imposter syndrome, imposterism, that kind of thing has increased, seemingly after the summer of 2020. A spotlight has been placed on the importance or the newfound importance of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So there's a lot of discourse around imposter phenomenon in workplace culture right now. And how and then there's more discussion about how it's not only a you thing, which I love. So when we were talking about opportunities to get back to Kenyon and kind of what topics we could potentially talk about, this felt right. So we just figured right time, right place. And so we've both experienced this in real ways. And I know some of you out there have experienced this in real ways. And so now that we're both leaders in our workplaces and in positions of power to consider how we perpetuate and combat structures that uphold imposter phenomenon, we'd like to share a few ways that we will do that, or we do that with you. Now, we're in two different work environments, me from a business perspective, Ted from an academia and nonprofit perspective. So we're able to cover like broad trends and compare specificities. And we've been talking about this for decades. So we feel we don't want to come off as experts because we will never say that. However, our experiences are our own, and this is a chance for you to get an idea of kind of the kind of things we've been combating, and maybe as you reflect on your experience, um, you can personify with us, or you can relate to us. So I'm going to pass it over to Ted to talk about why we're doing a conversation versus another way of doing this.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I am just seeing the love through the screen. So many people I know from so many different walks of my Kenyan journey. And those of you who know me, you know Melzetta, my other half. We are the prefix and the suffix, the Mel and the Ted. But yeah, so we were thinking about different ways that we could present this topic and tackle some of the issues that we're facing in our own careers. And we initially thought of doing this as a panel because it's always good to have multiple voices represented. But after some planning, we realized that the way that we navigate imposter phenomenon in our own journeys and as managers is often pretty messy. And that messiness might not be captured as well in a structured panel format. So we wanted to keep it conversational and story-centered. We also wanted to avoid asserting some type of authority over the subject matter, in the sense that we're not doing the academic research on this. We are everyday people who are talking about this really regularly and reading up on it when we can. But we think that, through stories and through follow-up dialogue, that is more representative and more authentic to our experiences and to our learning processes. And we wanted to share that with you. I also just think, stories, they make discussions of theory and concepts more real, and they also make them more tangible. And I need to add to that storytelling is a political act. And in this event, we're going to be talking about how imposterism is rooted in systems of inequity. So we cannot remain apolitical. The idea of counter storytelling is really driving us today. And that is the notion that we are providing tangible narratives that center the voices and the experiences of people of color and women. And those narratives seek to dismantle the dominant narratives that are often taken for granted as common knowledge as to what imposter syndrome is, and how it operates in day-to-day life. We think that there are a lot of misconceptions that our narratives can speak against directly. So yeah, as mentioned, Mel and I, we don't talk about imposterism as a concept writ large. We're not citing academic literature to one another. We don't present graphs in our conversation. We don't reference TED Talks. We tell each other stories about what's going on in our lives, what's going on in our work. And we have dialogue about those stories. And these are important tools for us for addressing imposterism in our lives, but also for coaching each other and for serving each other as, mentors, friends, and just as Mel said, hype people.
Okay. That's right. So what do we want you to take away from this today? So today we want to, like Ted said, clarify some misconceptions. Give you opportunity, give you examples of how to recognize imposter phenomenon in yourself and in those around you, and perhaps give you some tips on how to address it. Also identify how your workplace culture norms may perpetuate imposter phenomenon, and then ways that you as a leader can create a more inclusive environment as it relates to either proactively addressing imposterism or reactive if and when someone comes up to you with that kind of challenge. All right, Ted. So we're academics, right? At heart, we're Kenyan people. So we have to go and talk about the theory behind it. So Ted, can you define for us imposter syndrome?
Yes. So we actually tend to use the word imposter phenomenon and imposterism. Every time we use the word syndrome, just the air quotes, the scare quotes, they are there because we do not believe it is a syndrome at all. But long story short, imposter phenomenon occurs when people, often in professional or academic settings, doubt their skills, their talents, or their accomplishments, and have this persistent fear of being exposed as frauds, despite external evidence that they are more than competent, that they are accomplished, and that they have the necessary skills to succeed. So those experiencing this phenomenon sometimes believe that they do not deserve their success. That is the long and the short of it. But the problem that comes up when talking about imposterism is it's often referenced as an individual issue. You might have heard someone say, oh, well, you just need to recognize your own worth. You just need to believe in yourself. Don't doubt yourself so much. And listen, that is all well-intentioned, and we don't doubt, like, you know, the heart behind it. But with that said, it is problematic because it erases the fact that imposterism is driven by systemic forces that feed into those individualized fears. Imposterism is rooted in systems of inequity, and it is amplified by historic barriers to access and advancement. If I am the first person in my position who has looked at like me, who identifies the same way I have, then I don't have examples of success that are like me. So yes, you might feel like you don't belong at a table or in a certain room. It is also fed by microaggressions that speak to macro systems of exclusion. So it is no coincidence that imposterism affects women, trans folks, and people of color at significantly high rates. And empirical evidence does show that. I do want to talk about the syndrome because we don't call it a syndrome. So I want to, just take us back to the 1970s a little bit. In the original coining of the term imposter phenomenon by Clance and Imes in the 1970s, it was described as a phenomenon. The word syndrome came into daily discourse much later. And the reason that it is a problem to call it a syndrome is because it makes it seem a little bit like an illness, like something that can be diagnosed, but then also treated through some kind of individual prescriptive action. And that is not the case at all, because doing that, it erases the systemic foundations of imposterism. Also, this idea of pathologizing it, trying to make it seem like a biological condition, it adds this pseudoscience. And I really want to emphasize the word pseudo in this because it's not real science to call it a syndrome. And it's trying to lend this additional credence to something that is not an individual problem. And it weakens any notion that imposterism is driven by systemic forces. I will say that, yes, imposter phenomenon, imposterism and imposter syndrome, it is becoming more prominent in social discourse today. And that concept is often used incorrectly. And we don't want to be gatekeepers of the term, if you will. But with that said, you may have felt a certain way that might feel like imposter syndrome, but it might not actually be that. But I think it's important to properly define the term so that it doesn't lose salience. We need to name and define the phenomenon of which we speak. So imposter phenomenon is more than just a failure to fit in. You cannot fit into a circumstance or to, a certain, social milieu and not be facing imposter syndrome. I don't fit in all the time, but it's not because I feel like I'm going to be called out as a fraud. It's just because I don't fit in, It's not the exact same thing, and that should be noted. Imposter syndrome is also not the result of not doing the work. And I think Melzetta and I have had a lot of conversations about how people will claim to have imposter syndrome when they didn't actually do the work to begin with. And that's actually the opposite of imposter syndrome, because the idea of imposterism is that you do have the credentials, you have done the work, yet you still feel like you haven't done enough. You still feel like someone's going to call you out for not being good enough. I like to reference the work of Maddie Breeze. She is a sociologist who does a lot of work in higher education. And Breeze talks about how some folks like to claim to have imposter syndrome as a form of social currency. By claiming to be the other through imposter syndrome, they're able to claim space and resources that were designed to address the people who are actually feeling it. And it further perpetuates the power structures that instantiate imposterism. So this is a really short definition. I know that there are a few folks here who could probably go hours and hours in conversation about this, but I think we want to get to the stories. We want to kind of veer over to how does this impact our careers and our day-to-day lives. So I think we're going to start with Mel. And okay, this is our moment. Take a moment. We're going to put our vulnerable faces on now. Take off the academic hat, put on the, okay, this is who we are hat.
Right. We're opening the proverbial trench coat. Okay, so thank you, Ted. I mean, having a PhD as a best friend is chef's kiss. Anyway, so I'll talk to you a little bit about my story and the time that I've experienced imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon. So it feels like I've been dealing with this my whole life because I was the first to go away to college in my family. And so I find myself in situations where I am the first, the one and only, or the one of few. And for those of you who have experienced this yourself, you can understand that isolation can be the playground of imposter syndrome, where you're the only one, you're constantly doubting yourself. And so whenever I experience this, I go through this. I experience something new, I go through this. Like, for example, I was elected to be alumni member of the board of the trustees. I'm like, why me? Am I good at, like, should I be on this board? Like, so many questions. But anyway, I'll go back to my work example. So after Kenyon, I was accepted into the Wells Fargo Leadership Development Program, where I worked for about 7 years. And I started in the call center, where we did a rotation program. And then after that 1 year, I then was dropped into the Sacramento phone bank and was asked to manage a team of 17 bankers who were on the phone. And our schedule was 7 p.m. to 4 a.m. You can imagine what a banking customer is like during those hours. And we were still responsible for the same sales, service, and quality as the daytime team. Now, I had worked my way up in Wells Fargo for about 7 years, where I ended as the assistant vice president for financial crimes. Really cool job, right? After working in that job, I then left to get my MBA at the University of Rochester because I wanted to shift into HR for technology. So I used the MBA as a tool to be able to do that. Now, understand, I had worked my ass off that whole time. And so I then joined an MBA HR rotation program at Comcast after the University of Rochester. And my first assignment was to be reporting into the EVP of HR for the Comcast cable business. And I was responsible for a population of 3,600 phone agents, right? So I was responsible for launching a sales compensation plan for 36 36 call center agents. Now, up until that point, I knew call centers like the back of my hand. I knew compensation, I knew quality, I knew sales, I knew how to run a call center business. But because this was a new function in human resources and in sales compensation specifically, I struggled with imposter syndrome hard. And the way that it manifested itself a lot of times was through fear of fucking it up, right? That I wanted to do so well that I was paralyzed, and it was like a sense of analysis paralysis, because I didn't want to show up wrong. I didn't want to seem like I didn't deserve to be there, because I felt that a lot. We would sit in these executive meetings with my boss, who reported to the CEO or to the head of HR for a company that had hundreds of thousands of employees at the time, and that was heavy for me. So another way that it showed up was on conference calls. Way back in the day when we had polycoms and we just used, polycoms for conference calls. Remember those days? Whenever I have to give a status report on my business, or just sharing information or asking questions, we used to do that via conference call. One day, my manager wanted to give me some on the spot feedback. He was like, Melzetta, I noticed on conference calls, you shy away from delivering the information that the team needs. Why is that? And I said, well, I'm nervous, like I'm still new at this, and I don't, I'm not really, I don't want to come off as a know-it-all. And he was like, well, I think he said, I think the impact of that is that you show up weak. He said, people want to know that you know exactly what you're talking about, because this is a thing that you should know, right? If you are the expert in HR compensation, you have to show up that way. And in my head, I know call centers. I've studied compensation. I've studied how to do this. I know the things. But that voice was just like, I said, this job is too big for you. Why are you doing this? Right? And the way it showed up on calls was that I was scared. He said, you sound scared, unsure, not confident, and weak. It's like, is that your intent? And I was like, that's not my intent. I don't want to feel that way. But he was like, yeah, I need you to show up like you deserve to be here. And that was a moment he was like, use your voice as a tool. And he's like, more of what you communicate is based on how you communicate. It's less of what you say, how you say it, your tone of voice, and all that. Be conscious about how you show up on calls. And I will never forget that to this day.
I love that story. And this is not the first time I've heard it, but I want to be really explicit about a bias that I have. When I first heard that story, I just assumed, so was your boss a white man who said this to you? Like, how did that come off? And Mel, tell us more about your supervisor and how my biases may or may not have been correct.
Yeah, so when Ted asked me, I was like, no, my boss at the time was a Chinese man from the boomer generation. And he has been the most impactful boss that I've had to date.
That's really awesome. That's really awesome. How did you take that feedback at first? We're talking about, workplaces and how we can combat that. Do you think that he was really effective in combating imposterism in you, and why?
He shared a story with me. He was like, Melzetta, I had the same thing, the same issue. And I recognized it in you because I know you know what you're talking. The reason why I picked you for this role is because I knew you knew what you were doing. But the way it comes off is that you don't. And I struggled with that as a leader when I was first starting out, and I wanted to call it out to you. It was like a fear realized, right? The fear that I'll be found out as an imposter, the fear that I found out that I don't know what I'm talking about. And he told me, it sounds like you don't. It's creating a behavior that's realizing the fear that you may have. And him being authentic enough to call it out and vulnerable enough to share his story made a huge impact, for sure.
And I love that he was specific too. Like, he was very specific in his feedback, which I think is a big takeaway that I get from that story. I do have another question though. You do mention being a first. Mm-hmm. And tell us a little bit more about what is encompassed within being the first.
Mm-hmm. That's very real. I know several of us on this call, even looking at people who we know from the Pierce Circle Table crew. There's a lot of us who have been first in lots of situations. And I'll talk a little bit about Kenyon. Me and you meeting at Kenyon was a very Kenyon thing. Ted, if you don't know, he's from like random middle of Ohio, Barnesville, Ohio, which I love, by the way, now. I'm from Oakland, California. And the fact that two of us met at Kenyon and are like two peas in a pod is a very Kenyon thing. Anyway, what I loved about my experience is Dean Kennerly. is he on? I don't know if he's on here or not. But Dean Kennerly made it a point to create moments, right? That we, as first, a lot of us were first to go away to college, that we could find community and camaraderie. And it made it a lot easier to go to a place like Kenyon because it was hard at first, to be completely honest. And so those of us who have experienced the first, whether that's the first in your family, the one of only the first woman to do anything, the first transport, the first of anything, like it's the weight is like, you can't fuck this up. You are trailblazing, and everybody behind you there's lots of people behind you. And so don't mess it up. And the pressure is a lot, but it's not a question of if we do it, we have to do it, right? And so how we get through these moments of first, one of only, or first ones of only, or one of few, matters. And it's heavy. It's a lot. It's a lot to take on. And even now, I'm finding myself in spaces still one of a few, one of only, or the first. And now that I've matured a little bit more, not much, a little bit more, it's I know how to recognize when those voices are coming up and then address them then.
Love that.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, enough about me, Ted. What about you? Let's talk about your story.
All right. Well, my story is I'm not the first in my family to go to graduate school. And a lot has been written about imposterism within higher education. So my story is one of many. But before I start, I kind of want to take a moment to acknowledge the privileges that I carried into graduate school. By all measures, I was set up for success. I went to a private high school. I have family members who have sought higher degrees. I attended Kenyon and I did well at Kenyon. And, Kenyon does set you up for, independent, creative, and dynamic thinking. But yet still, I did take 4 years off after Kenyon for various research fellowships and jobs. And I get to grad school and it's like, whoa, all of a sudden I feel like, oh, if I make the wrong move or if I say something stupid, people are going to recognize the fact that I don't belong here. And that frustrated me a little bit because I was supposed to have been good at this. By all measures, I should have been good at this. And I was just feeling like I wasn't. And there are many moments when I could talk about this in classroom discussions, but I really want to focus on writing, actually, because I think that was an area, classroom discussion is something said, it's ephemeral, people will remember it in different ways, but writing, there's something very permanent about writing that really got to me at different parts of my PhD program. So I want to talk about my third comprehensive exam. Now, a comprehensive exam, a lot of PhD programs will have qualifying exams or comprehensive exams. In some ways, it's a bit of a rite of passage, but I think it also serves as a measure that you've achieved a basic amount of knowledge, argumentation skills in order to continue the process of research and writing a dissertation. For my third comprehensive exam, it was different than my first two. Because for my first two comprehensive exams, I was given like a very narrow topic to write about. And I listened to instructions really well. The second, I was given all of this freedom to talk about different bodies of literature and how they intersect, and it had to be more of my original thought from scratch. I definitely had a hard time with it. And what that led to in my writing was oversighting. Now, let me preface this with, listen, I don't know if I should use the word oversighting because you should always cite your sources.
Always.
Cite your sources all the time. But with that said, I was citing individual words, I was citing phrases, and the way that my discipline does citations is it's within the text. So I would have a sentence that would have maybe 15 of my own words and maybe 50 words of citation in it. And it was distracting from my original thought and my original argumentation. And it was something that I did because, well, they might not take me seriously, but if someone who's better than me said it, then they have to take me seriously. And they have to know that, what I'm saying is not wrong. They can't call me out for being a fraud because somebody else said it. So therefore, I have to be right. And this irritated my PhD advisor, wonderful human being, but he's like, why are you doing this? Like, it is so heavy-handed and it's taking away from your original thought. I mean, at the end of the day, still did well on the exam, but like he said, this is a problem in your writing that you're going to have to address when you're writing your dissertation. And guess what happened when I started writing my dissertation? Another problem emerged. Rather than oversighting, this is my own work. I am the expert on what I am writing about. But I would have these long run-on sentences with all of this hedging language, qualifying language, you know, like in spite of the fact that ABC and considering that XYZ, we should look towards 1, 2, 3 to determine that ABC does, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is one sentence. And it's just unwieldy. And I failed to make points succinctly. And in each clause, as I wrote that, I was thinking about how an external reader is going to try to call me out. How they're trying, oh, well, you didn't say this, so therefore you're wrong. And as a result, I just started writing in circles and talking about big ideas with these big brushstrokes without even presenting my data and what I am the expert on. What I ended up doing was denying my own expertise. And this ended up being a hill that I had to climb and that I had to be very intentional about overcoming. Like, I'm proud to say, yes, you know, I did get my PhD, but the mental turmoil that is attached to that, it can be rough.
I can imagine. You said lots of things you said that I want to address, but I'll just do a couple. You said I was supposed to do well. Talk about that self-imposed need to like, you have to do it.
So that is something that I've only started to think about recently, really in conversations that I've been having with Melzetta in order to prepare for this event. But like, as soon as she pointed out the fact that I was saying I was supposed to have succeeded, I immediately went to the model minority myth. Specifically for, you know, Asian Americans, including South Asian Americans, Indian Americans. For those of you who don't know of the model minority myth, I'll be really brief about it, but it's this idea that, you know, there are minorities that are exemplary in many ways, law-abiding, productive citizens or immigrants. They are intelligent, hardworking. They are almost prone to success. And obviously, like, even if it is a positive stereotype, it is still rooted in racism. I just want to make that very clear. And I think that the model minority myth, as, you know, studied and as, you know, discussed, it was actually in part a way to disenfranchise and degrade other minorities who weren't considered among that model. But in my own story, in my own experience, me not being good at this, it's like, I must be a deviant in some way. Like, I am not living up to the potential that is written in my culture, that is written in my DNA, but also that is written in my class status. You know, the fact that my parents could afford to send me to a school like Kenyon. I was set up for success, but I was like, I still felt like I was failing. And I felt like I've never even thought about it in these terms before. But the idea of being exposed as a fraud, like, I had that extra weight of, you're not supposed to be.
That's right. Oh my gosh, that's heavy. In the interest of time, I want to ask this question from Nadine because I think it's a really good one, and it is a great segue to the next section. It says, curious to understand. Thank you, Nadine, for the question. Curious to understand, is this often driven by intrinsic or extrinsic challenges? What do you think?
I would say the extrinsic challenges feed the intrinsic struggle. And it's not just, you know, like, it's not a failure to recognize one's own worth, because our worth is already being dictated to us, whether we like it or not. That's how I feel about it, you know? So I do think that that is a big part of it. I do think that there were systems that fed into my own impostorism, you know, like, just even within my grad program. You know, I mentioned classroom discussions. There would be, you know, I hadn't been in school for 4 years. I entered this setting where I've done the reading for the class, and then one student ends up talking about some theorist that I've never read before. Yeah. You know, and all of a sudden, the entire time I spent preparing for that, is lost on this discussion that has nothing to do with what we read. And at the time, I just felt bad about it. It was like, why don't I know the work of Judith Butler as well as I should? Like, you know, I might have heard her mentioned, you know, in a class like 6 or 7 years ago, but it was kind of like, but now in retrospect, I kind of recognize the fact that when a student does take over a discussion like that, it's alienating for the people who haven't done the reading. And I was never expected to have done the reading to begin with. And that, like, as Melzetta had said in her story, this idea of alienation. I felt alienated in those moments, which I think fed into a broader imposter syndrome. And, you know, there is a systemic way of preventing that, at least from, you know, a micro system, which is, let's focus on the reading, y'all. Let's do the thing that the syllabus said you needed to do, rather than allowing these other discourses to dominate. And I think, you know, as an instructor, I've, you know, taught at the college level before. Sometimes you have to balance it a little bit, but it's when those other conversations that alienate people run rampant, that's when people start to feel it a lot.
You know, as a person who has led lots of meetings and facilitated lots of trainings, that reminds me of the person in the meeting who just said something just to sound smart. It's like, why are you talking? What was the point of that? And it also reminds me that our systems, and we'll transition into how we can mitigate these kinds of challenges. How we reward people, the behaviors we reward, perpetuates this kind of stuff. Or if we're automatically, you know, assigning worth to the person who's the loudest in the room or who sounds the smartest versus what the actual assignment is, that perpetuates this kind of behavior. And so as we go into the next section where we talk about, now that we're, you know, in the positions to shape our respective organizations, how have we done that? And what are some ways that we've done that for our teams, for people around us, and others? And so Ted, do you want me to take this one, or do you want to go first?
Why don't you go for it, Mel?
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I want to talk about salary negotiations. So since I've been in HR, and understanding the wage gap and being, you know, being aggressive about closing it as quickly as possible, I started to do this practice during interviews where if we find a person, we love them, I personally call to make the offer. I do it over the phone, to call to make an offer on a Friday. It's my favorite thing to do. And one of the things that I do that intentionally because I want them to have a great weekend. And then I want them to take the weekend to actually talk to their family, to figure out ways if this is actually going to work for them. Because I want people to be excited about taking the job just as much as I am offering the job, right? And so typically call on a Friday, and I schedule a follow-up for Monday. So that gives them a time to ask any questions, and also often give them time to negotiate. So there's this one person, and I've only had to do this a couple of times. There's one young woman who we were, you know, excited and gushing about her because we really, really wanted her to join us. And it came to the point of the conversation where she wanted to ask for more money. And I could tell that the energy sort of just diminished a little bit. And she started to, like, you know, trip over her words. And like, I can tell what was happening, right? And so I said, for 1 second, I'm going to take off my HR leader hat and I'm going to put on my coach hat. Help me understand what happened. What's going on? She was like, well, I want to ask for more money. And I said, okay, that's fine. Are you scared? What's happening? Why are you, I noticed the shift in your energy. She's like, this is really hard. I was like, yeah, it's supposed to be hard, but you have to tell me, and you have to ask for more. Always, this is for everybody on the call. Always ask for more. Always. And I said, okay, with my coach hat on, I said, you have to ask me for more because you need to practice advocating for yourself. And the worst thing that can happen is that I say no. She's like, okay. Like, I know that was really weird for her. And I was like, okay, take this hat off let me put this hat back on. She was like, yeah, I like $5,000 more. And I said, okay, great. Because I make offers in a way that we pay our max budget, and I explained to her, I was like, these are the things that I take into consideration when making an offer. And I explained to her transparently all the things. And she was like, you know what? Give me 24 hours. I'll think about it. And I told her, so the ultimate answer was no. The actual answer was no. And I say that example because it was empowering to her, that I recognized the struggle, gave her space to be able to explain it without judgment, without fear of losing the job, right? The offer. And it also gave her a sense of trust, that now she trusts me as a potential HR leader, right? And so in the moment, what I find to help me get over imposter syndrome or imposterism is when the leaders around me, when the environment around me allows me to be vulnerable and say the things that I'm feeling and not feel judged for it. And I try to create spaces for my employees, for my leaders, for my peers, so that if and when they feel something that they need to get off their chest, but they're afraid to say or afraid to experience, I try to make sure that I give them the space to do that. Mm-hmm. And so the feedback that she gave me once she finally started was like, I never had that experience before, that I didn't expect you to be so open and so honest with me because companies don't normally do that. And I was like, yeah, don't go telling people that I do that for you, but I do that for a reason, because if I were in the same situation, I'd want somebody to be transparent and coach me on the spot as well.
I love that. I love that, Mel. And one of the things that I love about that is there's specificity in what you said. You gave exact reasons as to why salaries are negotiated that way, and the transparency and specificity are really important. And I think that kind of drives home towards, my story as a manager. So I run international fellowship programs and grant programs in my current job, and I've worked in international exchange for 15 years. And one of the things that I used to do was just be like, oh, if you're ever experiencing anything tough, just let me know. You can call me for anything, any reason, like big or small, just let me know. And you know what happened? People wouldn't call me all the time when they needed to. And, small problems became bigger problems. And I noticed this to be particularly true among young women of color, specifically women who are, have heritage in the country in which they're working. Yeah, that was a really kind of tough pill to swallow. It's like, well, why aren't you telling me things? Because I'm here to help you, yet you're not letting me help you. And then I was like, maybe I'm being like a little too broad with the call me for anything kind of talk. I needed to be more specific. So in recent years, I actually set up a communications workshop for our orientation, where I was very specific about the types of things that you could call me for. And like, maybe this one's good for a text. This is good for an email. This is good for a call right away. And I do think that that has produced results, because there is a question of, should I be taking up space on Ted's calendar right now? Should I be taking up space, period? And while I want people to do that, I wanted to make it less of a negotiation in their own head by presenting specific examples of how people have come to me and specific examples of how I have been able to help or set them up for success so that they can help themselves. Okay. And I think that that's a really, like, being specific really does help us, move forward with that. But we are towards the end of our time here. So I think we wanted to walk away with, a few takeaways that we hope that you can keep with you. And this doesn't have to be the only discussion about this. We know that there are some chats in the text, and we will also leave our contact information with everyone so that we can have more in-depth conversations. But one of the top takeaways, and this is like a very general takeaway, is that imposter syndrome is not a syndrome. I repeat, imposter syndrome is not a syndrome. It is not a disease. It is not something that can be cured through self-help. It is very much driven by systemic forces. If you leave with nothing else from this, we want you to know that. But okay, this is the tricky part of it, though. It's like, so I came in to this conversation as an individual who's experiencing imposter syndrome, and now you're telling me I can't do anything about it? Like, that's not cool. And I'm not saying you can't do anything about it, but I do think that the recognition that this is above and beyond you is important, for you to be able to name and define how it is working within your own life or within your own professional or academic space. I also want to reiterate what Melzetta and I have been saying through our stories, which is that imposter phenomenon thrives in hiding. It thrives in isolation. And our big thing for each other was we found our tribe. We found our community. It is so much easier to recognize imposterism in a best friend than it is to recognize in yourself. And I'm not saying that this is the solution to imposterism. This is not the solution, but this is just one of the things that you can do. Like, sometimes it takes a community to combat systemic forces. And it shouldn't be done just by yourself, within yourself, because that's going to make your life a whole lot harder. And Mel, what about managers? You being the boss that you are, what advice could you give managers for mitigating imposter phenomenon in the workplace?
That's a great transition. So for individuals, I'll also add, when we talk about tribe and community, one of the biggest things that I learned from a few of my mentors was like create a personal board of directors, right? People, put in your community and your tribe people who you know will call you to the carpet when they need to, people who know you and will hold you accountable, but also people who will hype you up. I am a professional hype person. Anybody who comes to my office who it typically, my goal is to make you feel better for having interacted with me. And what I want my leaders to understand, those of us on the call, and even the leaders who we have at our company, is that you can be a source of heartache or a source of support. And so the first thing is giving feedback, because the absence of feedback, that person will create their own narrative in their minds, right? And so the important part about giving feedback is being positive, being constructive, and being specific. A lot of times where you're doing a good job is not enough, right? Be specific about what that person is doing so they can identify behavior and they can continue it, right? So be specific, even when you're giving positive and giving constructive feedback. First, give feedback, be specific about it. The second thing is take the time to know how people are contributing and give credit where credit is due. A lot of times, the loudest person in the room gets the most recognition, and typically that person is just blowing a lot of bullshit. So being intentional about it, connecting with those people who are not the loudest people in the room. You get some of your really good ideas from people who don't really talk. But you taking the effort, whether you're a manager or a leader in business, if you're a teacher or professor, take the time to dig deeper into understanding how your people are contributing, so you can recognize them for it. And then be mindful, and I said this earlier, be mindful of the behaviors that you're rewarding, that your system rewards, right? So that if you think about how to combat imposterism from a systemic perspective, find ways to give feedback, give it specifically, be specific about it, understand how the people your ecosystem is in your ecosystem are contributing, and then being mindful of how you reward, because whatever you reward or whatever you put attention on is what will be demonstrated or repeated over and over again. The last thing I'll say is, and you've heard this by us getting feedback from the people who are in our lives, you're using vulnerability as a tool as a leader will unlock something in your employees or something in your people and your students or whoever your population is. If you're able to, if you are confident enough and feel like sharing a little bit about yourself, that goes a long way, because it gives space to do the same, for people to do the same. And so when I think about some of the deepest connections that I have with employees, it's been moments where we just connected on a human level, right? I explain to people, I don't want you to come in here feeling like you have to sound button up. Say what you need to say, how you need to say it, and we'll work through it later, right? And in that moment, and in those moments where you give space and you give grace to the people in front of you, or to the people you work with, that disarms them and lets them know, okay, so this is a safe space for me to say, I'm scared. I don't really think I'm good at this. I don't know how to do this, kind of thing. So the more you practice that, the more you do that, the better.
I love that. I love that, Mel. So we have a question in the chat from Sugar. Sugar wants to know, is imposter syndrome also the same as insecurity? I would say that insecurity might be a symptom of imposterism, but I feel like insecurity can be a much broader concept. There could be multiple reasons why you feel insecure, but there's a reason we're being really specific when talking about imposterism, and that's that fear of being called out, being called a fraud, despite evidence that shows that you're not. There's a reason that we are very specific with that, because it does speak to these larger systemic forces. Nadine mentioned, love the idea of authenticity and being vulnerable. We do too. Melzetta and I are criers. We try not to cry in front of employees, but every once in a while we find our moments, and it's beautiful.
I'm a sympathy crier. I'm on the brink of tears at any given moment. So yeah, totally understand that. I've just added my email in the chat. I just sent it to Ezzy. Sorry, Ezzy. Let me send that to everyone. Everyone in the meeting. Ted, if you could add your email.
Yes.
I thank you all for joining and participating. I hope that you got some tidbits from today. If you have any questions, or you want to follow up, or want to have a deeper conversation, please feel free to reach out to the school, to reach out to us, and we can connect. But with that said, Melted signs off.
Thank you all for coming.
Everyone.